Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Reimer-Barry, and it's my pleasure to offer this presentation for the virtual audience for the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture at the University of San Diego. I gave this presentation in person yesterday, and the recording didn't really work out very smoothly, and so I'm going to repeat some of what I said yesterday. But I also just want to express my gratitude to Jeffrey Burns, the director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, to Sharon for all of her work in organizing the event, and to my colleague, Professor Aaron Bianco, who is not able to join me today in this presentation. And so I'm going to be presenting some of his work on his behalf and with his permission. So you'll see on this slide that both of us had the opportunity to greet Pope Francis when we were in Rome for a conference at the Pontifical Gregorian University in May. And this brought us both great joy, and I'll say more about that as I walk through the presentation. The reason we were there was because there was a conference called Amoris Laetitia, Between New Opportunities and New Paths. So Amoris Laetitia is a document on family ethics. And before I talk about what's significant in that document and why theologians were gathered for the 5-year anniversary of that document, I just want to walk through some of the principles and rules of Catholic teachings on sexuality and marriage. And that can give us a foundation for the discussion and can also help us to see what's significant about the posture that Pope Francis invites us to take on, and what's new about the methodology that he proposes in Amoris Laetitia, which focuses on discernment and the appreciation of the complexity of people in their circumstances. But before we get there, let's walk through official Catholic teachings on sexuality and marriage. So within official church teachings, we say that our bodies are good in themselves and each person has inherent human dignity. Each person should be treated with respect in their bodies, and this happens through healthy sexual relationships. Sexual violence in all forms is contrary to human dignity. This is a really important piece. It shows that the church is, on the side of those who have experienced marginalization and oppression and against any experience of sexual violence and especially rape. The church teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman, and we see that not only in terms of sacramental marriage, but also in their work opposing same-sex civil marriage. Genital expression of sexuality is only appropriate between a heterosexual married couple for the dual purposes of love and openness to procreation. This is something that we've seen repeated since Humanae Vitae in authoritative Catholic teachings. It does come up again in Amoris Laetitia. We see this in documents about Catholic theology of marriage, the limitation of sexual love to married couples, and for the purpose of unitive and procreative love. Intentional contraception, intentional sterilization, and intentional abortion are acts that are deemed illicit. And healthy sexual relationships are supposed to foster the common good. So in Catholic social teaching, we often describe these as an opportunity to think about how a stable family life supports a strong social order. This is not unique to Catholicism, and yet that's still sort of the linchpin of the connection between sexuality and social justice. So that's the background for this document of Amoris Laetitia, which actually began through a listening process in the Synod on the Family, this global listening process that then was filtered through the clerical process of the bishops. And Amoris Laetitia reflects the Pope's listening through that Synod process, and then also to the work of theologians in the development of church teaching on gender and family and sexuality. Some of the important ways that this document moves the tradition forward are seen on this slide. So one of the things that's important is the way that this document does talk about relational justice. In other words, not just what we might say is a framework for sexuality that thinks of, an appropriate sexual relationship by sort of checking boxes. Are you of age? Are you heterosexual? Do you have the intent to procreate? These sort of boxes or norms that have tended to frame the ways that we talk about sexual ethics in the Catholic Church. And there's much more of a focus within this document on relational justice, from the framework of the dignity of every person and how every person is worthy of affection, care, and relationships that are normed by relational justice. We also see an emphasis on the equal dignity of women within this document. That's very significant. That's something that we don't always see in Catholic teachings within the tradition. I'll say more about that later, but that reaffirmation of women's equality, of women's full humanity, is something that is clear within Amoris Laetitia. We also see a kind of reality check that Pope Francis admits that families come in different shapes and sizes. There's an admission of the reality of this diversity, the plurality of family expressions that we see. This is the reality that faces many people in pastoral ministry within our parishes today. So it invites us to think, where is God within this reality, and how are we to address some of the hopes and challenges of our life together as church? He also talks about the beating heart of family life as love. So this framework of love as the center of family life remains very important within this document. That's followed up with this claim that marriage is for life and love. That could be thought of as a posture sort of more broadly, but sometimes also that's thought of in terms of procreation. True love is never coerced. This is a very important claim. Again, it's a recognition of the reality of sexual violence, but also the pernicious reality of sexual violence, how that is not of God. Pope Francis states that true love is mutual, reciprocal, both a gift of the self and affirming of the self. And when he's talking about tradition, Pope Francis does not simply restate previous norms. He does talk about fidelity to the tradition, but he lifts up some particular aspects of the tradition as particularly important for us to privilege today, namely love, mercy, and tenderness. So it's those aspects from the Gospels that he wants us to continue to focus on and to apply to family life today. For many, this means moving away from a legalistic framework and moving towards a framework of discernment. I want to give an example of this, the way that Pope Francis draws on tradition by citing Thomas Aquinas. This is a 13th century scholastic theologian. And the part in bold there is the quotation from St. Thomas, and this is in number 304. So here, Pope Francis is saying it's reductive simply to consider whether or not an individual's actions correspond to a general law or rule, because that is not enough to discern and ensure full fidelity to God in the concrete life of a human being. This is a really significant section of Amoris Laetitia, because what he's trying to do, even though I started this presentation by kind of walking through the traditional rules or norms of authoritative church teaching on sexual ethics, what we see is Pope Francis inviting us to engage in a very different kind of methodology, that this is not a sexuality that is going to be based in sort of new norms or new rules. And he says it's reductive to think about that we could ever come up with a good list of rules. Instead, he says we need to incorporate this lesson from Aquinas in our pastoral discernment. And so this is what he draws from Aquinas. Although there is necessity in the general principles, the more we descend to matters of detail, the more frequently we encounter defects. In matters of action, truth, or practical rectitude is not the same for all, as to matters of detail, but only as to the general principles. and where there is the same rectitude in matters of detail, it is not equally known to all. The principle will be found to fail according as we descend further into detail. So what is he saying there? When he starts there saying that there's necessity in the general principles, that's a way of saying there are some general ways of framing principles within our tradition that could remain valuable for us. But we should not think of these principles functioning in a legalistic way as if we could then apply them to people's concrete situation deductively and simplistically. Instead, when we look at the realities of the details of people's concrete lives, and this is especially the case in terms of sexual relationships and the messiness of everyday relationships and sexuality and family life, family dysfunction, and sexual relationships. He's saying we can't assume that we're going to be able to have a rule that applies to every situation, or that we're going to be able to describe the same rule for all. So this is an important caution for us, even in terms of the method of doing Catholic theology of marriage, in this context. So as he continues, he said, it's true that general rules set forth a good which can never be disregarded or neglected, but in their formulation, they cannot provide absolutely for all situations. This is, I think, an important posture for us to have in mind as we consider some of the really exciting claims within Amoris Laetitia that also could challenge us when we think about the gifts and promises of pastoral ministry today. Now, again, my colleague Erin Bianco is not able to join with us today, but when we were in Rome together, he was able to present on the joys and struggles of ministry with LGBT Catholics. And he has significant experience with this, and he was bringing the experience of the LGBT community into the conversation within the conference. So I'm going to share a little bit about what he was able to communicate to those who were in the conference there together. He began by describing his deep love for the church, but also a realistic view of the magisterium, and sometimes the magisterium's unrealistic views of love and sexual morality. Professor Bianco said, "We need to remember, as scripture tells us, that where there is love, there is God." He suggested that this be the starting point for a true dialogue with the LGBT community, because there are so many in the LGBT community who have experienced love in relationships, and they see that as an experience of the divine. And so how can we bring that wisdom into our own understanding in the wider ecclesial community? How can that help us to shape our understanding of how the Spirit is acting within our ecclesial community? He also drew on Cardinal Christoph Schönberg's statement from Vienna, who said, quote, "Personally, I find it touching that at a time when marriage is losing its radiance, couples who feel and live homosexuality want that ultimate form of partnership." Aaron also shared particular stories from his ministry. He told us about John, a 76-year-old man from Southern California who grew up going to a Catholic school and attending Mass with his family. At 18, John confided in his priest that he was gay, and the priest told him that he needed to repent and squash that part of him, or he would go to hell. John stayed away from the church for 58 years. Only recently has he returned when he found an inclusive Catholic community. So Professor Bianco drew on what Pope Francis wrote in Amoris Laetitia when he challenged those of us there with these words. It's a matter of reaching out to everyone, of needing to help each person find his or her proper way of participating in the ecclesial community, and thus to experience being touched by an unmerited, unconditional, and gratuitous mercy. No one can be condemned forever because that is not the logic of the gospel. Francis continues, here I am not speaking only of the divorced and remarried, but of everyone in whatever situation they find themselves. So Professor Bianco drew on that to talk about the possibility that Pope Francis might be also including John in that statement. In whatever situation they find themselves, no one can be condemned forever because that is not the logic of the gospel. For John, Dorothy Day's story had been informative and helpful for him in his own life. So this quote that's on the slide here, we have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. That had been a powerful quote that Aaron also decided to draw on. So Professor Bianco also shared that listening to undergraduate students from the USD community had been very helpful as they were seeing the importance of raising awareness about harmful language about homosexuality in church spaces. Many students, including one particular student, Cameron, whose story Professor Bianco shared, found the description of God's unconditional love to be very affirming. So harmful messages about homosexuality in church spaces can be dehumanizing and can lead teens to self-harming behavior and even to suicide. So Aaron shared from the Trevor Project that LGBT young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 from religious families are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than straight young adults from religious families. In Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis writes in 306, in every situation when dealing with those who have difficulties in living God's law to the full, the invitation to pursue the via caritas must be clearly heard. Fraternal charity is the first law of Christians. So this is the law of love that Professor Bianco talked about with Cameron. Another story that was very powerful for those of us at the conference to hear was the story of Joan. Joan is a trans woman. She has lived as a woman for 31 years. And she has many friends in the transgender community who have given her lots of love and support. She told Aaron that the only problem was that she's hidden that she's transgender from her parish community, or had for some time. She feared that the pastor would remove her from her ministries at the parish and maybe ask her not to attend anymore. And this fear, the fear of being denied participation was weighing on her. In Amoris Laetitia 305, Francis states, for this reason, a pastor cannot feel that it is enough simply to apply moral laws to those living in irregular situations, as if they were stones to throw at people's lives. This would bespeak the closed heart of one used to hiding behind the church's teaching. So Professor Bianco said, when it comes to welcoming the LGBT community, this is exactly what is happening. Pastors are hiding behind the law and not listening to the lived experiences of these individuals. But Pope Francis also said, we put so many conditions on mercy that we empty it of its concrete meaning and real significance. That's the worst way of watering down the gospel. Another story that Professor Bianco shared with those at the conference was the story of Kathy, who is civilly married to her wife, Victoria. They'd been married for 10 years, and being a part of a church community is very important to them. But for years, they didn't think it was possible to join their parish, and they had been watching Mass on television. They thought that they might be shunned if they thought to go to Mass together as a couple. In Amoris Laetitia 308, Pope Francis says, I sincerely believe that Jesus wants a church attentive to the goodness which the Holy Spirit sows in the midst of human weakness. A mother who, while clearly expressing her objective teaching, always does what good she can, even if in the process her shoes get soiled by the mud of the streets. Aaron explained that Kathy should feel as welcome in her church community as anyone else. She should be free to live out her call to full communion, not as a second-class citizen who worries what is appropriate for her and what is not. And he drew on what Pope Francis told a press conference in September of last year, that even the Pope has never denied communion to anyone. For those ministering to the LGBT community in the United States, they need to hear from Pope Francis concise words of welcome and complete acceptance. Professor Bianco said, we're at a crossroads as a church, and ambiguity is not what the faithful need. So I'm sure that you can agree with me that these powerful words make an important contribution to the conference and to our ongoing discussion about the implementation of Amoris Laetitia within our church spaces. Aaron Bianco's presentation was well received by those in attendance. It gives me great hope as a Catholic, and I was proud to call him my friend. His final slide was a quotation from Bishop McElroy, now Cardinal McElroy, who said, Pope Francis is calling us to reach out to everyone with a message of radical inclusion. Sadly, there has been an estrangement and an alienation with LGBT people, and the church needs to take steps to heal it. So all of us are invited into that task of taking steps to heal our church. I had the opportunity to present on women at the church at the conference, and I began by describing some of the shortcomings of Amoris Laetitia from the perspective of feminist theology. I explained that the presentation of gender norms within the document perpetuate gender-based inequities, that the presentation of the ideal normative family as heterosexual, middle class, procreative, and patriarchal can implicitly stigmatize and shame non-normative family structures. And I also talked about how the Pope draws on history and this missed opportunity to attend to the misogyny, colonialism, heterosexism, and racism embedded in Catholic constructions of anthropology. It is significant that Pope Francis names patriarchy as problematic in Amoris Laetitia. He writes in 54, history is burdened by the excesses of patriarchal cultures that considered women inferior. I just, though, want to draw your attention to the way that this is phrased in the past tense. Patriarchy is not just in the past. Patriarchy also shapes our present. Right now, I'm not going to go through the details of the statistics that I brought to bear in my presentation. I did distribute a handout, and I will make that available through the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. But when I had the opportunity to present on this topic, I gave a lot of details about the gender dimensions of economic inequality all around the world, about gender roles, about violence against women and children, and about consent and bodily autonomy. And that led me to these questions. Can our church claim to support the agency of women as day after day those same women are not empowered to say no to unwanted sexual activity, are physically assaulted in their own homes, are burdened with greater care work than men? Can the church truly claim to value motherhood if it results from abridged agency, coercion, or violence? Can the church claim to defend healthcare as a human right while simultaneously denying women medications and medical procedures that female patients claim in conscience align with their family planning needs and vocational aspirations? This is how I would frame it as a theological problem. Everyday misogyny is perpetuated by magisterial teachings that reinforce men's dominant position over women within all church structures. This perpetuates gender inequality. And we see that not only in traditions of marriage, but also in the ecclesial structures of the Catholic Church. Here's some textual examples of some of those shortcomings that I described when we're talking about sex and gender in 56, when the Pope acknowledges that today women wish to study, work, develop their skills, and have personal goals in 173. When he restates the exclusive and indissoluble union between a man and a woman as the ideal vision of marriage in 52. And when he says that de facto or same-sex unions are not equal to marriage, also in 52. In 53, Pope Francis says, surely it is legitimate and right to reject older forms of the traditional family marked by authoritarianism and even violence. Yet this should not lead to a disparagement of marriage itself, but rather to the rediscovery of its authentic meaning and renewal. So I applaud the first part of this claim, that it's legitimate and right to reject older forms of the traditional family. I applaud this recognition that violence and authoritarianism does not create healthy and loving family and sexual relationships. At the same time, I think we need a healthy degree of suspicion in the claim that we already have in our possession an authentic meaning of marriage. I think we need to remain more open to what we're learning from not just feminism, but also from the LGBT community about what love and relationships look like. I had the opportunity, like I said before, to greet Pope Francis in person. And when I did, I was able to share some artwork and meaningful messages from students in Chula Vista, California. And I won't be able to explain everything that the students shared, nor would that be appropriate. But one of the key ideas from the students is that they experience God when they experience love in family life. And again, that resonates with the same quotation that Professor Bianco drew on before, where there is love, there is God. So that's a picture of me giving that book of images, of pictures and of messages from students in Chula Vista to Pope Francis. The reason I decided to do that was because when I was thinking about all of the voices who would be gathering at the conference, it occurred to me that there would be a lot of adults talking about family life, and that the missing voices there included the missing voices of children. So I wanted to be sure that in some way he also was able to hear from children, although certainly children in Chula Vista do not speak for all the children of the world. But at least there were some voices of children there present in the gift that the Pope was able to receive from us. When Pope Francis spoke to us as theologians gathered in the Sala Clementina, in the room where you see the picture here, those of us gathered for the conference, he encouraged us to go forwards and not backwards. He encouraged us to use transdisciplinary methodologies and to meet people where they are and practice the logic of mercy in our theological work. It was a very affirming space. It was a very powerful moment, I think, for a lot of us. But I especially appreciated that encouragement for us as moral theologians thinking about the complexities of family life, to move forwards, not to go backwards. My summary then of this presentation is that as we continue to think about our family ethics within Catholicism, it's important for us to move away from a rigid, rule-based or legalistic framework and think about what it means to meet people where they are in their concrete circumstances, and to foster opportunities for discernment and dialogue about all of the moral issues that individuals and communities face, whether it has to do with communication patterns in families, with discernment about how many children one is called to have or how to be able to support the children that one already has, or to care for the elderly within our communities. You know, there's so many different ways that families are experiencing different kinds of challenges in different spaces. And we need to be able to foster greater opportunities for discernment and dialogue in our ecclesial spaces. That means we need to be able to listen to one another, and we need to recognize that the church doesn't always have all of the answers, but we can foster a process where we can continue to listen to the Spirit in our midst. Thank you again to Jeff Burns for the opportunity to present, and to my colleague Erin Bianco for joining on this journey. Wish you all the best.